Good morning, everybody. It is great to see everybody here this morning. We're grateful for your presence. I know we have a few visitors I've had an opportunity to meet already, but if you are visiting, we want you to know that you are a special guest to us, and we are grateful that you have made the decision. We know you have choices on how to spend your time and where to worship, and we thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. I'll make one quick announcement about our home Bible studies before we get into the lesson. The sign-up sheets are in the back of the auditorium in the foyer. So there's 3 different days of the week. There's going to be a group that meets on Thursday nights at 6:30, Friday afternoons at 2, and then Sunday afternoons at 4. So if you want to participate, just sign up on the sheet. We're looking to start those. I think it's going to be the end of the month. I had a couple of conversations this morning, and some of the hosts, there's holidays coming up and a couple other things going on, so it'll probably be the end of this month as we kick those things off. So we want you to participate. We want everybody to be there, so just be sure to sign up so we can plan appropriately. Leon Logothesis was an investment broker, and by all accounts, he was incredibly successful at what he did. In fact, from the outside looking in, it would appear that he had it made. He had a great income, a 6-figure income. He had the big house, the nice cars, all the material blessings that you could possibly want. But yet, even though everything on the outside looked good, he himself would say that on the inside, something was missing. He actually struggled with depression, and he just felt unfulfilled in what he was doing. So he decided to do something radical with his life. He walked away from the 6-figure job. He gave up a lot of the material possessions to become what he described himself as a global adventurer. Now, I don't know exactly what that is, but it sounds pretty cool. But anyway, that's what he decided to do. And through the course of that process, he came up with this idea of hosting a documentary. And in 2017, Netflix actually picked up his documentary and began airing it. And the name of his documentary was this. It's called The Kindness Diaries. And the premise of the television show was that he wanted to circumnavigate the globe and be dependent entirely on the kindness of strangers. He didn't take any money. He couldn't accept money from other people, but he had to depend on them for gas and food and shelter. So in season 1, he set out under the Hollywood sign. He left, traveled the U.S., went through Canada, boarded a boat, made it through Europe, made it through Vietnam and other areas, and eventually ended up right back where he started, under the Hollywood sign. He did this on a vintage motorcycle with a sidecar that he nicknamed Kindness, and he managed to do it entirely on the generosity and kindness of strangers. You know, we live in a world where it's easy to be cynical, isn't it? It's easy to see the worst in people and fail to recognize that there are still a lot of people that show kindness in the world. But you think about that word kindness, and it's important to us in our spiritual lives. It's a part of the fruit of the Spirit that Paul would lay out in Galatians chapter 5. And in fact, in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12, Paul would say that as God's chosen ones, we are to put on compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. You see, kindness should be a part of our lives as Christians, as followers of Jesus, as His disciples. But what does it look like, and how are we to put on this idea of kindness and live it out in our lives? This morning, I want us to look together at a story of kindness found in Scripture. And I want us to read about this story and see if we can't understand some things through this story that's been left for us that might help us better appreciate this word kindness, and also maybe give us some ideas about how we can show kindness in our lives to others. And we'll start this story. It really begins in 1 Samuel chapter 17. So let's begin our journey there. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And as you're turning, we'll talk a little bit about what happens in this particular chapter. One of the most famous stories in all of the Old Testament is found in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and that's the story of David and Goliath. So David, as you remember, is a little shepherd boy, and he has just killed the great Philistine warrior and giant. And as we come to the end of this chapter, in verse 55, we read these words. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. You see, David, as a young boy, has just experienced this incredible victory. And Saul brings him into his own house, and something special happens between Jonathan, Saul's son, and David. There was something unique and special about their relationship, and it happened almost instantaneously. Have you ever met somebody that you just clicked with immediately? You just had this special bond with? That maybe there were things in your life that brought you together. You just kind of saw things the right way. I don't know how your life is, but I've kind of learned over life that there's just a handful of people that I can count on in any circumstances. I've got one friend in particular that he and I have been friends for 25 plus years. He lives 3 days away from us. But yet we stay in contact. We text on a regular basis. We'll talk on the phone. And I know if anything happened that I really needed him, he's there. There's just something special about our relationship, and it's kind of always been that way. There was something special about Jonathan and David in their relationship. And even immediately, we see these things that Jonathan did symbolically as if he recognized already that David was going to be the one to ascend to the throne. He gives him his cloak and his items of war. He sees something in David, and Saul sees it too initially. But our story will continue as we pick up in verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. It's amazing how pride and jealousy can destroy relationships, isn't it? You see, that's what happens with Saul. David comes back from war. David's done everything that Saul has asked of him. God's been with him, and David has experienced success. But you see, Saul couldn't handle it. Pride and jealousy entered his heart, and he no longer looked at David as someone that was special, that was a blessing to him. He eyed him with envy. And as a result, from this moment on, he set out to kill David. In fact, if we were to continue reading in this chapter, in the verses that immediately follow, he tries to kill him with a spear. I want you to turn a few pages to 1 Samuel chapter 20. David has now been on the run, hiding from Saul. He comes back to Jonathan to talk with Jonathan, his friend, the one who his soul and his heart is knit to tell him, Your dad, he wants me dead, and I need your help. Let's begin reading in verse 1. David fled from Naioth and Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt and what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And he, Jonathan, said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so." See, Jonathan just has a hard time wrapping his head around this. My father, he's not going to do this to you. There's nothing that my father hides or keeps from me. But David, as we would continue to read, comes up with this plan, and he says, "Look, it's the beginning of a new moon, and I know your dad's going to have a feast, and I'm going to wait. I'm going to go away for 3 days. And when Saul asks, 'Where is David?' you tell him that I've gone back to my city for sacrifice. And if he responds favorably, then you know all is good. But if he responds angrily, then you know that he is intent on killing me. And I need you to come and tell me." So let's pick back up in verse 12. "And Jonathan said to David, 'The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow or the 3rd day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also, if I do not disclose it to you, and send you away that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever. When the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies." And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. So Jonathan agrees to this plan that David has asked for. And Jonathan says this, he says, "If my father's intent is to kill you, then here's what I ask of you." Because you see, Jonathan knew, if that's the intent, he knew that his dad wouldn't be successful. Jonathan recognized that God was with David. And when David ascended to the throne, a natural part of that process would be that Saul and his household would be removed. That there would be no threat coming from Saul and his household to David and his reign as king. So Jonathan asked him this in verse 14. He says, "If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die." Now our lesson's about kindness, and here's what I want you to do for a minute. I want you to take that word, steadfast love, and I want you just to hold on to it. I want you just to file it away, because we're going to come back to it. The Hebrew word for that phrase, steadfast love, is the word hesed, and we'll talk more about it. So all of this is the background that leads us to our story on kindness. So now let's transition our thoughts to the details of the story. And I want us to fast forward some 20 years probably in the life of David to 2 Samuel chapter 9. As the book of 2 Samuel opens, what we find is Saul and Jonathan killed. Both of them have now died in battle. David has ascended fully to the throne in every way. Physically, symbolically, he is now in every way God's chosen king of the nation of Israel. And he is actually what we might say at the height of his reign. Everything has gone according to God's plan and blessings for David, because David has been committed to following the Lord. He's experiencing the blessings in every way possible. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And they called him to David, and the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he said, 'I am your servant.' And the king said, 'Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?' Ziba said to the king, 'There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet.' The king said to him, 'Where is he?' And Ziba said to the king, 'He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lodabar.' Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lodebar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. As we think about the story, I think it's important to stop for a moment, and I want you to consider with me all of the individuals that are a part of this story. And it starts with David, the king of Israel. And as we just made mention, David is at the high point of his reign as king. Just a couple of chapters later, we're going to see his kingdom begin to crumble because of sin in his life. But at this particular moment, everything he has done has been in accordance with God's will. He's recognized God's sovereignty, and he's been God's servant, and he's been blessed. And now David wants to somehow repay that blessing, as it were. So the second person we see mentioned is a man by the name of Ziba, who was once a servant of King Saul in his house. But after David had risen to the throne and ascended to his reign, Ziba had experienced success in his own life. We read that he had 15 of his own sons and 20 servants. But yet what we're going to find is he himself would once again become a servant, even though he had experienced great success. Of course, Mephibosheth is an important individual in this story. He was born into a king's house, the grandson of the king. In fact, at one time, by lineage, he would have been an heir to the throne. But according to the text, what we find here is he's been living in this place called Lodebar, which literally means nothing or without pasture. It was a desolate place far from the palace life he was born into, far from the riches of Saul and his land and his possessions. And the text tells us that he was crippled in his feet. 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 4 gives us a little more detail about how that came to be. As Jonathan had been killed and word made it back to his house, there was a nurse that was taking care of Mephibosheth. And as she received word that Jonathan had been killed, she scoops up the young boy and she begins to run, and she falls, and Mephibosheth, through that process, becomes injured and crippled in his feet. You see, he can't take care of himself. And he's in this desolate place dependent upon someone else, who's the next individual that we'll mention, a man by the name of Machir. We really don't know a lot about him, but we know this: he was hospitable. He opened his house to take care of this young child at the time that had been injured. And in fact, it's not the only time in the book of 2 Samuel that we would see him have this type of hospitality. In 2 Samuel chapter 17, he does the same thing for David, as David again finds himself on the run. And then as we continue on through this story, there's one other individual, at least, that we read about, and that's Mephibosheth's son, Micah. Again, not much is said, it's just his son. But I think it's worth noting that as David opens up his house, we see the possibility that if jealousy and pride were to creep back in, that there's people that could have this feeling that the throne was rightfully theirs. Mephibosheth as Saul's grandson, and now Micah as the great-grandson, if they had desires of somehow having this insurrection to overthrow David, they would have had at least some level of rationalizing that in their mind. So just the individuals in the story are interesting. They give us insight into what's ultimately going to happen. Now let's look at some of the details. And the first thing is this. I want you to notice David thinks back on his agreement with Jonathan. He says, I want to show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. You ever made a promise that maybe as time passes, it kind of slips your mind? Maybe it's not something that you have to fulfill immediately. And maybe it's several months or maybe even years down the road, something triggers a thought that brings that idea back into your mind. I almost think that's what's going on with David here. Maybe David has paused and he's reflecting on the great success he's had in his kingdom. And he remembers that conversation with Jonathan, where Jonathan says, don't forget to show your steadfast love for me and my family. And I ask you to file that word away. Steadfast love has said. Here's what's interesting. That's the same word translated kindness here. In our Bible class this morning, in the auditorium, it happened to be on kindness. And we looked at the book of Isaiah. And we found the exact same thing, that this same Hebrew word is translated steadfast love, sure love, faithful love. And what's important is for us to already understand that when you think about the idea of kindness, it has to be connected with this idea of steadfast, sure, faithful love. And as David reflects on that thought, what we see is David casts the net wider than he has to. Because notice what his question is. Is there a servant of the house of Saul? And of course Ziba comes and he asks Ziba, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show kindness to? You see, his agreement was Jonathan. He could have just as easily said, is there anyone of the house of Jonathan that I may show kindness to? He would have technically been correct, but he cast the net farther than he has to. I want you to think about Mephibosheth and his position as he comes. He's been living in isolation, maybe even on the run, we might say. I got to believe maybe there was a little bit of fear in him as he came before David. Maybe he didn't know all the circumstances. Was David now seeking his life just to make sure there was no threat to his reign as king? I'm going to guess it's interesting. He was born into the king's house, but yet this is more than likely the first time he had been in the king's presence since Saul and his father were killed. I wonder what was going through his mind as he enters back into the very places that his father had once lived and the lands, seeing those places that his father once owned. But yet what does David do immediately? He tries to put him at ease. He says, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. You see, David's intent is to show kindness. But David recognizes where that kindness comes from, because David says in verse number 3 that I want to show him the kindness of God. David recognizes that all he's able to do is demonstrate what God has shown him in his life without conditions, showing mercy. Very similar to how David had ascended to the throne himself, isn't it? Through God's kindness towards him. And then we think about the cost that his kindness came. It cost David something. It cost him land. It cost him possessions. He gave up something. He also opened himself up by inviting Mephibosheth to have a seat at the table. He didn't have to do that. You see, it wasn't a food issue. He'd already given him food through the land and providing for provisions. This had to do about access to the king's table and being in his presence, having access to the know of what the conversations were within the kingdom, restoring him back to a place of honor. Not just giving him the land and say, good luck, go and enjoy. Treating him with honor and dignity. But it also cost Ziba something too, didn't it? Ziba himself had risen to a place of prominence, but yet he himself went back to being a servant, tending the land, fulfilling what David the king asked him to do. So we think about this now. What's the point? What's the point of this story? What are you and I to make of all of this as we sit here this morning? Is it just a nice story that we read and we talk about the individuals and maybe make a couple of comments and then think, all right, that's pretty neat. Now let's go out and kind of go about our business. You see, there's a lot of differences, aren't there, between us and the individuals in this story? I mean, I'm going to assume, I don't guess I know definitively, but I'm making an assumption none of us were born into a royal family that have rightful ownership to a throne. I'm going to guess maybe that's not the case. I know none of us are kings today that rule over land or any significant state or anything like that. So how do we build a bridge from them to us to help us understand what the point of this story is? I believe there's a key phrase found in this passage that's the point of the whole story. We've already made mention of it, actually. It's found in verse 3. If you like to mark in your Bibles, I would encourage you to mark this phrase, the kindness of God. You see, that's really the point of the whole story. It's a living example of how God's kindness can be displayed in the life of somebody else. I hope you've listened to the story of Mephibosheth, born into this incredible place, a place of honor with access to incredible things, access to the king and his place and his residence and all the blessings that came along with it. Displaced because of the actions of his grandfather, really, to live in a place that was desolate, without pasture, dependent on the goodness of somebody else to even take care of him. But yet he ends up being restored to a seat at the king's table. A place of honor, a place of dignity, given back land and possessions that were once his grandfather's. Does this story sound remotely familiar? How did life begin for mankind? Born into a place of incredible beauty, a place with access to the king, but yet a place lost. And you and I still suffer for that decision of our great, however many greats we want to add, grandfather, Adam. Spiritually living in a place desolate, without pasture, separated from all the things that come along with the king and the kingdom and everything it has to offer. But yet, what are we offered? We're offered a seat back at the table, aren't we? A seat at the table of the king, in God's presence, to enjoy his blessings once again, to enjoy his goodness. You see, Mephibosheth's story is our story. And we get this living example through the life of David as he demonstrates God's kindness. And it's God's kindness that has been given to us that we should see, that should motivate us to live and display kindness in our lives. But how do we do that? What is kindness in us? What are some things maybe to consider from this story that helps us connect the dots from God's kindness to us displaying it in our lives? I think the first is this. We have to make the connection between kindness and God's image. I think David recognized that. That was really David's purpose, was for him to take the kindness that God had given to him through his ascension and success to the throne and now give it back. Give it back to a family that he had entered into this covenant relationship with. And you see, none of us would even understand what kindness is if it were not for God and the kindness that he has shown in our lives. And David recognized he had a responsibility to now in turn live that out in his life in the way that he treated others. And we have that same responsibility to see ourselves as Mephibosheth, separated from where we should have been originally, restored back to a seat at the table, and now take that example and live it out with others. But we also recognize that there is many times a cost associated with kindness. You see, David could have done a lot of things to show kindness. He could have simply said, hey, look, I want to send some sheep and I want to take some food and I want to show kindness by giving these items to someone of Saul's house. But he didn't do that. He restored the land that was his, that he had inherited, that was first Saul's. But it didn't just come at a cost to him, it came at a cost to Ziba too. You know, sometimes God wants to use us as His avenue of kindness. It may cost us something in the process. But you see, God had a plan, and He has a plan now. And the question is, are we willing to sacrifice those times that kindness comes at a cost to fulfill what God expects out of us? But there's also this. There's this idea of kindness and involvement. Kindness is not done at a distance. Kindness is something that's up close. It's personal. Machir, as far as I know, other than here in 2 Samuel 17, perhaps the only 2 times he's even mentioned in Scripture. I guess we might even say an afterthought on the pages of Scripture. Doesn't seem to be anything spectacular, but the reality is there is something spectacular about him. He chose to get involved in the lives of people when they needed it. Mephibosheth couldn't take care of himself in a desolate place. Machir takes him in. He provides for him. David, when he finds himself on the run, still the result of his own sin, the destruction of his home life because of his sin with Bathsheba, the impact it's had on the kingdom, Machir once again sees somebody in need and shows kindness. You see, kindness requires involvement. And then there's this, kindness and acceptance. We have to be willing sometimes in our own lives to accept kindness from others, don't we? Again, I think about how Mephibosheth might have felt as he was summoned to the palace. There might have been a part of him that said, I don't know that I want to go do this. Fearing for his own safety, his own life. But yet, it was important for him to accept this offer of kindness because without it, we wouldn't have this incredible example of God's kindness. And I wonder, even in my own life, it's easy sometimes to put up walls, isn't it? To keep people at an arm's distance, to not necessarily let people know the things that are going on. And how many times maybe have I in my own life prevented somebody else from being able to show the kindness of God towards me because of my unwillingness maybe to just open myself up? You see, there are people that are open to showing God's kindness, but we need to be willing to let them into our lives and accept that this is a part of God's family. It's a part of God's community. It's a part of God's plan. It's a part of being in God's image. It's not always just about showing it. Sometimes it's also about accepting it and letting people in our lives. As we think about this incredible story of kindness, I think it's good maybe to challenge ourselves with what now? What does it mean in our lives and what now as we prepare to leave here this morning? And maybe the simplest challenge we could have for ourselves is this. Who will I be intentional about showing kindness to this week in my life? Who do I know that needs me to show kindness to them in the way that God has shown kindness to me? Because you see, just like everything we study and read about, it's not just a story. It's meant to be lived out in our lives. It's meant to change our hearts. It's meant to influence us in a way so that we become the next individual that God uses as His story continues on today. You see, we can be the next David. We can be the next one that does for somebody else what God has done for us. I hope we'll all be challenged by that thought as we prepare to leave here this morning. Who will I show kindness to this week? As we get ready to leave, though, I think it's important to ask, do we need God's kindness in our lives this morning? And the obvious answer to that is yes. And God's kindness comes in various forms and in various ways. And it might be that You just need a time of reflection in your own life this morning as we stand to sing a song, but maybe you're struggling in a way that you just need to know that other people care. Maybe you need somebody's arm around you. Maybe you need somebody to pray with you. We're here as a church family, and we would love, if we can, to show God's kindness to anybody that needs it this morning. If we can help you in any way, just let us know how while together we stand and sing.